Tor, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Evening. You're the first one in today, Tor. Pablo, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? How's things, Pablo? Evening, Miles of CMF. Good to see you as well. Tor on YouTube. GP, good evening, Miles and all CMF. Good to see you, so brother. How you doing? How you been? Good to see everyone's tuning in one by one. Let's go. Hey, Miles, CMF Coatus, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Okay. Good evening, Professor Miles and the rest of the CMF family. Funky brother, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? By the time everyone tunes in, essentially for the first part of the live show, let's do the intro, disclaimer, and what we're going to be going through on tonight's live. And by that time, everyone's tuned in for the first article, which we're going to go through on tonight's live. So, welcome to the CMF Live. If you're watching this for the first time ever, CMF stands for Crypto Miles Family. My name is Miles. You can tune to this live Monday to Friday, 10 p.m. London time onwards, where I share the most recent news regarding cryptocurrency, CBDCs, AI, politics, regulations, pretty much vital information for you to know about regarding the world completely transforming into a digital sector, essentially. The disclaimer of this live, as always, is not financial advice, not political advice, and whatever I say is only for entertainment purposes. And we also do Q&As in this live as well, which means if you do have any questions or any statements to make, put it down in the comment section. I'm more than happy to read them out and give you a response. Now, on tonight's live, we're going to go through essentially US, China, and Europe news as well, like we did just yesterday regarding tariffs. Some other news that came about regarding maybe the EU is going to be putting tariffs on China now, which is an interesting plot twist, you could say, because it is just been the United States that's been tariffing countries left, right, and center. But it also seems like the EU might be preparing to tariff China essentially as well. We're also going to go through on tonight's live regarding news from Hong Kong, for example, regarding stablecoin regulations. We're going to go through on tonight's live. We have some other essential news to go through on tonight's live regarding partnership news announcements, purchases from major, essentially well-established institutions entering inside the crypto space. We've got news coming out of Russia regarding stablecoins also, which we're going to go through on tonight's live. Also regarding the mortgage and crypto bill. Apparently, there's a bill now regarding cryptocurrencies going into lending, borrowing, and mortgage inside the United States. There's a bill coming forward. We're going to talk about on tonight's live also regarding the White House steps, essentially, that regarding the CFTC, and some other news on tonight's live as well regarding European Central Bank and more regarding stablecoins, and also Ripple news to go from tonight's live, and quite a bit of banking news to go as well. Now, the first news we are going to cover on tonight's live is obviously from the essentially the US Treasury essentially Secretary hinting that Europe might be essentially putting tariffs on China, which honestly is an interesting plot twist because nobody saw that one coming. Everybody saw the one where essentially Trump said he's going to put tariffs on everything, but nobody saw the other one coming where the EU starts tariffing China. But before we go through that news, let's go start a conversation first, and then we'll go straight into the first news. And I would also just like to take a second just to say thank you so much to everybody from the CMF who's watching right now on X, who has already essentially liked and retweeted this live on X. Thank you so much to everyone who has done that so far. So far, the live is on 5 retweets and 4 likes, and live has just started, which is still amazing. And honestly, thanks so much to everyone who has already liked and retweeted this live and you're watching this on X. If you haven't, CMF members, retweeted this live or liked this live on X, please retweet and please like the live. If you're watching this on YouTube, CMF members, and you've already liked the live, thank you so much. You can put a comment outside the live. Thank you so much as well. If you haven't and you're watching this on YouTube, drop a like and essentially put a comment outside the live also. Now, let's see where we're at inside the comment section, and then we go straight into the first news regarding the EU, US, and tariffs in China, essentially. So let's see where we're at. We were at here. Hi, brother. Come on. Good to see you, brother. How you doing? How you been? Hi, Miles of family. Aaron. Good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Happy Pisces. Good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Let's go CMF. Let's go JP. Have you been? How have you been, Miles? I've been doing good. I hope your stream don't play up tonight. Me too. I hope to. Can you please say my name? My name is Dana. Dana, is that your name? Sure, Yusuf, no problem. Dana, how you doing? Now, US Treasury is what we'll talk about first. So apparently the US Treasury has come out and started throwing hints that possibly the EU is about to put tariffs on China in some sort of a way. So here it is. The US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that potential European tariffs against China could be anticipated. His comments following the ongoing US and China tariff negotiations, underscoring the essentially global trade tensions that are going on now. The remarks highlighted potential broader economic essentially impacts and market volatility, particularly affecting risk assets and global economic relationships right now. Treasury Secretary Scott Benson discusses essentially potential EU tariffs against China amidst the ongoing US-China trade negotiations. Apparently, the reason why the EU would pressure China regarding tariffs is because the EU now has that great relationship once again with the United States, as everybody saw essentially, yesterday or the night before, where the EU had a sit down with Donald Trump in front of, hundreds of essentially news journalists asking them questions regarding their trade deals. So the EU and the US are now sitting on the same table. China isn't. And apparently, the EU is going to put pressure on China the same way the US is putting pressure essentially on China to come to the negotiation tables. This isn't great for the essentially Chinese market space whatsoever, their international essentially market space. Because if China essentially loses Europe and loses US, they're losing massive market share right there. Treasury Secretary Scott Benson suggested the European Union could essentially impose tariffs on China amidst the ongoing US-China trade negotiations. And the discussions remain focused on the tariffs truce essentially extension between the United States and China. Benson, alongside US trade representatives, also emphasized the importance of maintaining essentially dialogue with China. No official EU statements have confirmed the tariff intentions yet. The hints are only coming from the US Secretary Scott Benson for now, and the talks continue under President Trump's guidance on potential extensions. Scott Benson is US Treasury Secretary. The US and China will continue talking about the tariff truce before essentially it expires. President Donald Trump will make the final call, said on Bloomberg. Financial and crypto markets show resilience despite potential shocks from trade tensions right now. Historically, similar situations have led to increased volatility, but current data essentially does not reflect significant market shifts related to these developments. The crypto market space and essentially the stock market isn't reacting essentially in a shock way still, even though the crypto markets are down 1 to 2%. That's not drastic shock in any sort of a way that the EU might be putting tariffs right now on essentially China backing the United States. Potential impacts include volatility in risk assets like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Market analysts point to previous US and China trade talks as examples of how tariffs can influence essentially market behavior. Through essentially, though, direct effects on crypto remains uncertain for now in the general essentially crypto space markets. Historical patterns from past US and China, essentially EU and China trade disputes suggest short-term volatility in global markets, including cryptocurrencies. Noteworthy examples from 2018 to 2021 highlight the potential reactions to heightened tariff discussions. Experts suggest essentially that layer one assets such as Bitcoin and Ethereum may essentially experience increased trading volumes under uncertain essential trade conditions. Prior indicators show possible market shifts, though current analysis lacks immediate on-chain data and correlation. Once again, the crypto market space could be shown essentially as a sector that, essentially hedging against that scenario. So this could play out both ways. You remember when I told everyone it could play out both ways regarding trades, regarding tariff situations that are going on? I said option number one is the crypto space could be seen as an alternative market space to hedge against tariffs and macroeconomic effects and geopolitical tensions. The crypto market could react in a positive way. The other outcome was that the crypto market still essentially, follows Bitcoin's footsteps, which is essentially Bitcoin sometimes reacts like a tech stock, which means if tech stocks go down, Bitcoin goes down, so does the crypto market space. And therefore, it's not seen as a hedge against anything in that matter. So it could still go either way. Again, last time I said that, it played out as option number one. The crypto market was actually seen as a hedge against that uncertain scenario. So is it going to play out option number one again if the EU does come out and put pressure on China? It is also something I said about 2 years ago on this live, which my words were essentially that, if China doesn't come to some sort of agreements with the US, that the US will pressure China or put it on the sanctions, essentially, or get every other market space to not work with China in any sort of a way, which you can see signs of that now with if the EU does come forward, according to Scott Benson, the US Treasury Secretary, that, the EU comes forward and goes, we're sanctioning essentially China, or we're putting tariffs on China is pretty much the same thing because it could lead up to sanctions if China doesn't come to negotiation tables. it's not looking good for China, is what I could say. The crypto market hasn't reacted in a shock way so far. Neither has the stock market in any sort of a way. We're only down 1 to 2% crypto, which is perfectly fine. Now, Hong Kong is what we're going to talk about next, but it is an interesting, plot twist. Normally, it's U.S. tariffs, everyone, and now it's EU's jumping on the bandwagon, tariffing China in favor of the U.S. Now, Hong Kong is what we're going to talk about next, and stable coins is what we're going to talk about next. But before we go through this news, let's go inside the comment section first, and then we go straight into the next news. So let's see where we're at inside the comment section first, and then we go straight to the next news. Good evening, Miles. It's CMF, free and forever. Good to see you all. How you doing? How you been? Adi, good evening, Miles. Sorry, a little late on. No problem, Adi. Good to see you all. How you doing? How you been? Good evening, Miles and CMF. SB, good to see you all. How you doing? How you been? Morning, Miles and CMF. Shelly, good to see you all. How you doing? How you been, Shelly? Good evening, Miles and CMF. Manny, good to see you all. How you doing? How you been? Hi, Miles and CMF. Stormy, good to see you all. How you doing? How you been? Hi, Miles and CMF. George, good to see you all. How you doing? How you been? Good evening, Miles and CMF. How you doing today? I'm doing great, Carlos. Good to see you all, brother. How you doing? How you been? Now, Hong Kong. Regulations, stablecoins. Since the US has passed the Genius Act, a lot of other countries are coming forward and thinking about essentially releasing some sort of regulations for stablecoins because they don't want to get left behind from the biggest market space on the planet, which is the United States market space. So since the US passed the Genius Act, South Korea, as I revealed yesterday, is implementing some stablecoin regulations to pass through. Hong Kong has talked about some back and forward of regulations in terms of stablecoins are going to pass through. Also, even Russia is talking about regulations for stablecoins since the US passed the Genius Act. Even there's been discussions from banks from essentially China, or even CEOs from China that had discussions with the Chinese government regarding stablecoin regulations. That's what happens when the biggest market space takes essentially one footstep inside the crypto space. Everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon, which is brilliant because all of that adds liquidity later on towards the crypto space. Top 10, top 20 crypto projects most likely. Now, Hong Kong. Hong Kong essentially implements new stablecoin regulation frameworks to be able to compete with the US market space. The stablecoin regulation in Hong Kong is set to begin this Friday with a essentially transitional phase for current issuers overseen by Hong Kong's monetary authority. So this Friday, Hong Kong stablecoin regulation is about to go live. The regulation impacts stablecoin issuance, mandating compliance or winding down essential operations, potentially essentially reshaping Hong Kong's crypto landscape and affecting essentially stablecoin related market activities. This could bring liquidity to the table essentially not overnight, but as time goes by. Hong Kong's new stablecoin regulation aims to consolidate financial stability by setting clear guidelines for issuers. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority will lead the regulatory oversight. As a part of this framework, stablecoin issuers will receive temporary licenses if they show compliance, and potential companies unable to meet requirements must cease operations within specific timelines. So if there is a stablecoin essentially out there that doesn't meet essentially, every stablecoin manufacturer will pretty much receive some sort of temporary license from Hong Kong. So which means Tether will receive essentially a temporary license. So will Circle with USDC, so with Ripple with RLUSD, so with essentially PayPal with PYUSD, and so on. And they will all receive some sort of temporary license. Once essentially they show compliance to Hong Kong's regulations, they get a full license. Their temporary license goes away and they get a full license. If they don't show compliance during that temporary license of a stablecoin mandate, then they'll lose their temporary license and be kicked out of the Hong Kong market space. So the question remains, is USDT about to get kicked out of another market space, or is it going to be compliant for once in its life to any sort of regulations? Market dynamics could shift as issuers assess compliance challenges. The regulation introduces a structured approach to align with existing financial policies. Market observers predict cautious optimism, essentially, as the regulation introduces a structured approach to align with existing financial policies. Market observers predict essentially cautious optimism as clarity essentially unfolds. Industry reactions appear cautious to date. Core industry leaders and have not essentially publicly addressed the regulations. No recent direct commentaries essentially on stablecoin regulations as of July 29, 2025. Research teams highlight regulatory shifts as pivotal essentially moments for market maturity. Regulatory essentially prudence could foster trust, while institutional engagements may bolster adoption. Historical patterns suggest cautious growth as compliance landscapes become much more clearer. So Hong Kong is about to essentially pass stablecoin regulations this Friday, which means stablecoin issuers will receive a temporary license. If they're approved, they can continue forward in Hong Kong. The bigger thing about this is that the more we get stablecoin regulations around the world, the more liquidity that's going to be entering into stablecoins. The more liquidity that enters into stablecoins, high chance that stablecoin essentially liquidity is going to be entering into cryptocurrencies. High chance that those crypto projects that are chosen essentially is going to be top 10 to top 20 and so on. So this is why I say it's, you have to be well positioned now that we're going into a regulated market space. It's all about institutions and banks and governments. So you have to be well positioned in these crypto projects that that institutions and banks will be heavily involved in with, and even governments. So it says it's lost connection. I don't know what's happening. Can everybody see me and hear me? For a second on my screen, it said lost connection. I don't know what's happening. Hi, Miles, CMF, Golden Dragon, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Okay, before we go through the next news, let's go start a comment section first, and I'm going to go straight into the next news. Let's see where we were at. We were at here. Hi, Miles, CMF. George, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Good evening, Miles and CMF. How you doing today? Carlos, I'm doing great. How you been? Carol, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Evening, Miles. Jack, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Hello, Miles and CMF. Carol, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? I don't. And then sup CMF, let's go. Davey, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Evening, Miles, CMF peeps. Semper, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Good evening, Miles and CMF. Mike, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Utility will kick in a 4-year cycle. Let's go. Davey, good to see you. How you been? Hi, Miles, CMF. Golden Dragon, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Good evening, Miles. Michael, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? How are you today? I'm doing great, Michael. How you doing? Back on, let's go. What did I miss? Michael, quite a bit actually, but we'll do a gist of what we talked about at the end of the live. So, next news on tonight's live. One particular company has decided to jump on the bandwagon of creating some sort of a crypto portfolio, and they're starting off with Bitcoin. Not only that, but they've actually going to be making a very, very, very heavy purchase of Bitcoin. So here it is. 21 Capital will list with over 43, essentially will list with over 43,500 Bitcoins, becoming the third largest corporate holder of essentially Bitcoin. 21 Capital announced that it expects to receive an additional 5,800 Bitcoins worth approximately $680 million at current market essentially prices. By time it closes previously disclosed business essentially combinations with Cantor essentially equity partners at a Nasdaq essentially listed special purpose acquisition company, the inflow will rise essentially 21's total Bitcoin holdings to over 43,500, surpassing all but two public firms globally on balance sheets Bitcoin's ownership. The planned essentially reserve accumulation represents a bet not just on Bitcoin's price, but on its long-term role as a monetary base layer for new financial infrastructure. We believe Bitcoin deserves a public company worthy of its essentially ethos, said Jack Marlos, the CEO of and co-founder of 21. We're not here essentially to beat the existing system. We're here to build a new one. Unlike traditional operating companies that hold Bitcoin as a hedge or diversification strategy, 21 essentially has been designed from inception as a Bitcoin native enterprise. It will forego conventional earnings per share reportings in favor of a new metric, Bitcoin per shares. This metric essentially allows investors to track the company's holdings on a per share essentially basis and monitor the values essentially of their equity directly in Bitcoin terms. Also, all Bitcoin held by the company will be custodian transparently on-chain with real-time proof of reserves available. Essentially, Bitcoin represents more than just a foundational protocol for freedom, transparency, and resilience, said essentially Pablo, the CEO of Tether. 21 captures that ethos in a corporate form. 21 is backed by a powerful institutional roster. Tether and Bitfinex are expected to be the majority stakeholders. SoftBank Group also holds a significant minority stake, while the remaining equity will be distributed among PIPE investors. Public essentially shareholders of CEP and CEP sponsors, Capital Fixer, The new, essentially 5,800 Bitcoin contribution includes Tether's recent acquisition of 1,381 Bitcoins alongside its obligation to purchase 4,422 Bitcoins as a part of the original business combination deal. The company has also made essentially confidential filings of its S4 registration statement with the US SEC in preparation for listing, where it plans to essentially trade under the ticker symbol XXI. These also developments position 21 as a straight corporate essentially vehicle to offer Bitcoin exposure to equity investors without essentially dilution risk or operational burdens or essentially the legacy of the business. While companies like Tesla and Strategy integrated Bitcoin into a larger portfolio, 21 essentially is positioning itself as a pure play Bitcoin balance sheet with institutional grade essentially custody, real-time reporting, and no operating cash flows outside the asset itself. The firm's launch also essentially comes aimed essentially of interest in corporate crypto treasuries. According to reports, over 60 public companies globally have adopted Bitcoin or other essential crypto assets into their treasury or investment essentially frameworks. So 60 companies globally are involved inside the crypto sector right now. Some hold Bitcoin, some hold other cryptocurrencies in their crypto portfolios. 21 essentially is doing a interesting version of a Bitcoin essentially portfolio for a publicly listed company. They're doing Bitcoin per shares, something different compared to what MicroStrategy normally does, which is print shares, sell them, buy more Bitcoin, which is also what other companies do. They follow MicroStrategy's footsteps. This one's an interesting pattern, but what I'm more interested about is once again another company coming forward, jumping inside a crypto space, creating a crypto portfolio to add that credibility factor towards the crypto space that matters. Now, on the topic of stablecoins, going back to stablecoins for a second, Russia apparently has been using a Rub stablecoin to do a loop around on payments, and they've just found out. So here it is. Ruble-backed stablecoin A7A5 moves $40 billion. Sanctions workaround. A Russian ruble-backed stablecoin tied to a Russian defense bank and a sanctioned payments firm has been seeing usage spike sharply, with over $40 billion essentially dollars moved through the system to data, according to blockchain analytics firm EP344. The stablecoin called A7A5 was launched in January, essentially, based payments essentially platform A7. Both firms essentially under Western sanctions. A7A5 is pitched as a tool for helping Russian businesses settle cross-border trades, especially with countries like China, without using traditional channels such as SWIFT. A lot of people have been saying for the longest time that Russia might have been using Bitcoin to buy oil, is the headlines we see essentially on news articles. That Russia is using essentially Bitcoin to buy oil. That's what they're continuously using, or they're using USDT. It turns out Russia created through their own bank essentially a stablecoin by the name of essentially A7A5, which is the digital version of Russian ruble, in January. And since January, they've been using that stablecoin as a loop around. According to EP344, the analytics firm, daily transfers through A7A5 now exceeds $1 billion a day is being transferred on that chain. And the coin's market cap has more than tripled to $521 million in less than 2 weeks. The report says July saw a noticeable spike in the volume, liquidity, and circulating tokens. TRM Labs, another blockchain research firm, said A7A5 appears to be a part of the growing network of essentially Russian registered essentially entities, helping Russian firms route payments tied to the movement of a dual-use goods from China into Russia by Central Asia. While EP344 couldn't verify the source of the funds behind the transaction, the surge in A7A5 usage suggests that growing demand for alternatives to mainstream financial systems, which remain largely closed off to Russian banks due to sanctions imposed after Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The interesting part is the name of the stablecoin, A7A5. A7 is a company in Russia. A5 is also a company in Russia. Both of those companies are sanctioned by the West, and both of those companies came together in Russia and created a stablecoin called A7A5. Earlier this year, the EP344 provided intelligence to US authorities in the investigation that essentially took down Gatorix, a Russian-linked crypto exchange accused of listing illicit transactions. Also, the reason why Russia toned down using USDT is because Russian officials said that too many of their wallets on USDT were essentially blacklisted, which means they was already left in the wallet in any sort of a way. So USDT, essentially Tether, started blacklisting a lot of Russian, essentially USDT wallets, which also goes on the side of, is Tether even decentralized or is it just centralized? But anyways, that is why Russia has their own essentially stable coins. They've created it since January called A7, A5. Gatorix was essentially sanctioned by US Treasury offices of Foreign Essential Asset Controls, OFEC, in April 2022 for listing money laundering essentially connected to a ransom attacks and darknet markets. At the time, it was the third largest crypto exchange sanctioned by the Treasury. Russia did have a massive crypto exchange. Obviously, it's fully sanctioned. Despite the sanctions, analytics firm Epileptic noted that Gatorix transacts $60 billion after the designation. US authorities also indicated that the exchange's key operators have essentially apparently been apprehended in India and face extradition to the US. The move was a part of a broader clampdown on entities believed to be essentially assisting Russian nationals in evading essentially international sanctions through the use of cryptocurrencies. The US Department of Treasury, essentially Office of Foreign Asset Controls, announced penalties against 13 organizations and 2 individuals for such activities. A7, A5 said it added $100 million in new liquidity to its decentralized exchange through essentially, for now, some came through USDT, citing high demand and supply. Liquidity is gone in minutes, said essentially on Telegram. Apparently, the moment liquidity enters essentially Russia's stablecoin A7, A5, immediately the liquidity essentially empties out because that's how much in usage it is. Also, they went on to say that the time of launch, the platform would allow Russian businesses to pay for services and imports, particularly from China, while avoiding SWIFT. Do you know what this does? This makes not just the United States and essentially every other country around the world, especially in the G20, to move towards crypto regulations at a much more faster rate. It also pushes the US to move at a much more faster rate towards regulations so they can control market spaces where essentially countries that are sanctioned don't do loop arounds by creating essentially their own stablecoins. The faster we have regulations, the faster those kind of things can stop. Now, I don't care about Russia doing loop arounds. I couldn't care less if Russia is doing loop arounds to buy anything they want. What I care about is by Russia doing this, it's going to make other countries around the world go to themselves and think, well, we need to move faster in terms of regulations to get a control of this market space. Because if we don't move fast enough to control this market space, then it'll just become a black market space where everybody gets to essentially do anything they want inside of crypto space. It'll just be that Wild West again. So with Russia doing this, it actually puts pressure on other countries to move faster in terms of regulations. And that's what I care about the most. I don't care about what Russia is going to spend their money on. It's their money. They can spend on whatever they want. What I care about is that what Russia has done is going to infuriate the United States. Now, let's see what's inside the comment section first, and then we'll go straight to the next news. And the next news is regarding mortgages inside the United States. Now, we've talked about mortgages for the past few nights on this live, where essentially we talked about how some Democrats are against it and Republicans are for it, and the crypto is about to be entering lending, borrowing, and mortgaging services. But now it's getting a bit more serious. It's not just conversations between essentially politicians. Are we going to get mortgages? Are we not going to get mortgages when it comes to cryptocurrencies and so on? Because it's actually turning into a bill. So here it is. US bill introduced to include crypto in mortgage essentially assessments. So now it's becoming official. It's no longer just words between politicians regarding crypto entering the mortgage sector and lending borrowing sector. US Senator Cynthia Lummis today introduced the 21st Century Mortgage Act, urging essentially May and Freddie to essentially include digital assets in mortgage eligibility assessments without conversion to fiat currencies, which means you could buy a house using cryptocurrencies by getting a mortgage, and you don't need to transfer your crypto assets back to fiat to buy a house. So let's say if you have Bitcoin, you want to buy a property, you can use Bitcoin to get a mortgage and buy a property. If you have XRP, you can do the same thing. XLM, same thing. HBAR, same thing, and so on. This, you don't need to put it back into fiat to buy a property anymore. This move could revolutionize home ownership for younger generations, recognizing cryptocurrencies as legitimate wealth forms with significant implications for mortgage market liquidities and digital asset inclusion. Cynthia Luminous introduced the 21st Century Mortgage Act today to integrate digital assets into mortgage assessments. This move is a part of the broader efforts essentially to update financial systems in line with essentially modern wealth building strategies. William, the director of the FHFA, supports this initiative, reflecting a growing acceptance within government institutions. The integration of digital assets aims to expand home ownership opportunities among younger generations who are increasingly investing in cryptocurrencies. The bill requires lenders to consider these assets without converting them to fiat, potentially without essentially converting them to fiat, and potentially enhancing the liquidity and viability of cryptocurrencies in traditional finance. No immediate public reactions from major industry players or regulators have been observed. However, Cynthia Luminous highlighted the bill's importance, stating that the home ownership should adapt to a modern, forward-thinking generation. Market responses from corporate sectors remain forthcoming as the bill progresses through. Analysts also essentially suggest the bill could drive essentially policy innovation, gradually essentially leading to regulatory adjustments. If established, this practice may foster trust in digital assets, boosting essentially their acceptance across financial markets. And this development essentially aligns with global efforts to integrate digital currencies into traditional financial systems. So the US actually turned the crypto mortgage, essentially lending and borrowing services, into a bill. It's no longer a conversation between Republicans and Democrats. It's actually turned into a bill, the 21st Century Mortgage Act, where if you buy a house using cryptocurrencies, they don't have to, essentially you or essentially the person you're buying from doesn't have to turn it back into fiat to be able to essentially use it as legal tender, because your crypto technically is legal tender. That gives so much credibility essentially to cryptocurrencies once that bill goes through. I'm loving this. The more regulations we get, the better the crypto space looks, and the essentially more investments, more liquidity that enters towards the market space, because then it will be seen day by day as a much more legitimate place than what it was seen before. Also, it makes my job much more easy as well. I have a blockchain startup company called CoinMove.one, and regulations have always been a burden for me, even inside the United Kingdom. It's very difficult to have a blockchain company in the UK because the regulations just are not there in any sort of way. And the UK government doesn't really, the current government we have doesn't care about essentially anything to do with cryptocurrencies. Even though they pretend to, they couldn't care less about them. They have other things on their mind, which makes zero difference to anyone's lives in the UK, just to put it that way. I'm not going to go too much into that because freedom of speech doesn't exist in the UK anymore. So, with essentially this happening inside the United States, it makes life much more simpler for people who hold cryptocurrencies and for people who own blockchain companies who are inside the real estate sector as well. Through CoinMove, you could buy properties and so on, essentially using cryptocurrencies. Multiple cryptocurrencies are allowed. This makes life so much easier for companies like me also. Not just easier for crypto buyers, but also easier for crypto sellers. Now, and this is also something that's most likely going to get adapted worldwide. Once the US gets close to passing this bill, believe it or not, Hong Kong will be pretty much next on passing this bill. Dubai will be next essentially on passing this bill. So will Singapore, so will Japan, so will South Korea, so will the EU. And it'll just, be a ripple effect of countries back-to-back accepting this regulation. The same way the US passed the Genius Act, Hong Kong essentially is today, essentially on Friday, going to pass the Genius, their own version of the Genius Act. South Korea is about to pass their own version of the Genius Act, just because the US took one footstep more inside the crypto space. The rest of the countries will follow its footsteps behind it, which all of that equals to more liquidity inside the crypto space, which is what we want to reach those high numbers. Invincigo is what we're going to talk about next. Before we talk about Invincigo or ETFs, let's go inside the comment section first, and then we'll essentially go through the next news on tonight's live. So let's see where we're at inside the comment section. We were at, as I said previously as well, this is live, just like always. If you do have a question or statement to make, put it down inside the comment section. I read everybody's comments one by one. Good evening, Miles and CMF. Bull XRP, let's go. How you doing? How you been? Hi, man. Let's go. Definitely good season. How you been? Careful, people. Got another fake Miles on TikTok contacting me. Yeah, please be careful. There's a lot of people that pretend to be me. They're scammers. So there's a lot of scammers out there that pretend to be me or pretend to be other crypto influencers and so on. And they go around messaging people on TikTok, Telegram, WhatsApp, Instagram, X, or whatever. So please be careful. I will never, ever message you first. Never. If you message me, I will reply back. But I will never message you first. So if someone's messaging you first, it's not me. So please be careful. Hi, Miles and CMF. Peg, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? That is amazing. What I've been waiting for. Let's go, Shelly. Facts. And good to see you. Peg, how you doing? What's that about? So about that. I think I have acid reflux. I'm not sure. We'll probably take a, what's this about? This is a crypto live show that you can tune into Monday to Friday, 10 p.m. London time onwards. So I basically share you news, recent news regarding cryptocurrency, CBDCs, politics, regulations, Web3, AI, everything you need to know about the world transforming into digital space. So this is what this live show is about. And welcome to the CMF Live. And this is also episode 344 of the CMF Live. Shelly says, we'll probably take another 10 years to get to Australia like everything else. It's a fair point. It'll probably take another 10 years to get to the UK as well. The UK is becoming, very strict. Everybody remember 2 years ago when I used to do these lives, essentially TikTok times. So these lives originally started on TikTok, and then obviously I couldn't say certain words on TikTok, like CBDCs was a big issue on TikTok. If you said that, they'll just ban you. It was weird. But anyways, when these lives first started out, I said to everybody that if you want to know where your country is headed, just look at China, is what I said. 2 years ago, I said this. I said, if you want to know where your country is headed in this digital world, just look at China with everything they created. If there's, at that time, China was the first one at that time with a CBDC essentially wallet. China was the first time with essentially the social credit system wallet. It was the first essentially country to be going into wholesale CBDC. I mean, everything to do with this digital world, China was the first one to jump on it. And regarding surveillance also, China is very big on surveillance on their own citizens. So that's why I said 2 years ago to everyone. I said 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I said to everyone, if you want to know where your country is headed, just look at China, because your country is pretty much next. And the UK, essentially, well, surveillance is getting very strong. Let's just say that. It's going to happen in other countries as well. Now, there was actually a banker who was doing an interview, and he said the words, the moment essentially central banks, come in and create their own version of their own digital, currencies, it's pretty much game over the moment CBDCs get released. Now, it's only game over for people who don't understand essentially that they can actually do a lot better in life if they hold XRP. But again, not financial advice at all. I was there. We're on TikTok. Let's go, Mike. You were definitely. And yeah, every country, honestly, every country is pretty much en route to become like China. And you could definitely see elements of that inside the United Kingdom, especially in the United Kingdom and in the EU, to be fairly honest. Now, Invincigo essentially Galaxy proposes Solana ETFs on the CBO, Chicago Exchange, essentially. The Chicago Exchange has filed to list Invincigo, essentially Galaxy Solana ETF, aiming for a spot exposure to Solana with staking services, signaling a new frontier for US crypto investments. This ETF integration represents the growing institutional crypto acceptance, potentially boosting Solana's ecosystem and staking activities, while underscoring the regulatory momentum for advanced crypto offerings. The Invincigo Galaxy Solana ETF aims to provide direct, essentially spot exposure to Solana and integrate staking essentially rewards. This represents a significant step in the regulated crypto investments offerings inside the United States and will use actual Solana tokens held in cold storage. The ETF application was filed by Investico and Galaxy Digital for CBO, essentially BZX exchange, as the proposed venue for listings. This move highlights essentially the growing institutional interest and regulatory acceptance of stake as essentially service models. So another essentially another Solana essentially ETF on the verge of maybe happening if the SEC approves it, for crying out loud. It's going to be offering essentially staking services as well. The ETF, if approved, could yield increased institutional capital inflows into the Solana ecosystem, offering regulated and institutional-grade access. The move reflects the evolving landscape in cryptocurrency investment vehicles that now embrace essentially staking benefits. With no specific fund sizes was this essentially disclosed, the collaboration suggests a substantial market impact due to SIBO and Investico's reach. The Solana essentially is the primary asset expected to see heightened interest from financial institutions. Historical precedents such as past BTCs and ETF approvals led to essentially some sort of price surges. Obviously, Bitcoin had a much more bigger price surge compared to Ethereum ETFs, mainly because Ethereum ETFs didn't offer anything. If they offered staking services, then that would be something great. Now, moving on essentially from Solana ETFs to the White House. Apparently, the White House has delayed the CFTC's chair vote. It's a very odd move from the White House, but here it is. The Senate Agriculture Committee has pulled the planned hearing on Brian nomination to chair the CFTC, following a request from the White House just days before lawmakers leave for August, essentially recess. In an update to the committee scheduled on Monday, Chair essentially John and Ranking Member Amy said lawmakers would not consider Brian nomination to the chair the CFTC. A spokesperson for the committee told Cointelegraph that consideration of Brian's nomination was removed following a request from the White House. That's a very odd move. Is it possibly because Brian isn't the best option essentially for the CFTC chair? That's why the White House suddenly decided to pull his essentially nomination last second. So the CFTC is still going to be operating with its acting essentially chairman. Following essentially the request of the White House, Cointelegraph reached out to the White House for comments but has not received a response at the time of publication. The Agriculture Committee essentially have been scheduled to consider Donald Trump's pick to lead the financial regulator before going on recess on August 4th. The delay marked the second time the Agriculture Committee pushed voting on Brian's nomination. The body was also scheduled to consider a prospective CFTC chair nomination on July 21st meeting. As of Tuesday, it was essentially unclear whether the Senate would address Brian's nomination before or after going on recess. As president essentially for Baptism Commission, Brian served as a CFTC commissioner under Trump from 2017 to 2021. Having been nominated by former US President Barack Obama in 2016, he has also faced questions from lawmakers in June's Senate Agriculture Committee hearing and reportedly disclosed about $3.4 million in assets. Brian's nomination is significant as the Senate is expected to move forward with the CFTC and Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, would have been overseeing digital assets after returning in September. After Trump took office and former SEC Chairman Gary Gensler departed, the securities regulator essentially dropped investigations and lawsuits against several crypto companies, including Coinbase, Ripple Labs, and Kraken, regarding CFTC. Whoever heads the CFTC could likewise have influence over policies affecting the digital asset industries. Brian's potential confirmation to lead the CFTC could come as the commission is prepared to leave multiple vacancies essentially at the US financial regulator. 3 members of the commission 5-seat panel, former chairman essentially Rostan Binham and Commissioner Summer essentially and Christian essentially Goldsmith departed essentially early this year. Acting CFTC Chairman Caroline Pham said she planned to move to the private sector if Brian were nominated, and Christian Johnson said she would leave before 2026. As of July, Trump had not announced any potential replacements for the 4 seats expected to be vacant after the Senate considers Brian's nomination. But apparently, it's either the White House that doesn't want Brian anymore for the CFTC chairmanship, or it's just the Agriculture Committee that's just pushing deadlines and don't want Brian for the time being. If it's the Agriculture Committee that's pushing deadlines and don't want essentially Brian as CFTC chairman, then it's most likely that you could pretty much guess that Democrats like essentially Senator Elizabeth Warren might be behind it. if it's essentially, or rep essentially Maxine Waters, if it's the White House that's pushing for Brian not to be nominated anymore, then it would explain on the senses of that Trump doesn't seem as a viable, essentially, person to be leading CFTC anymore. But it's an interesting situation regarding the CFTC chairman, because they chose essentially Brian to lead it. Now they're changing their minds. Maybe Brian's not pro-crypto anymore. Or they just found something on it. Now, European Central Bank is what we're going to talk about next. But before we talk about the European Central Bank, let's go inside the comment section first, and then we'll go straight to the next news. So let's see where we were at. We were at here. Even Miles of CMF, Pierce, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Hi, Miles of family. Alex, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Now, European Central Bank warns. So the European Central Bank is sending out a warning that essentially, if crypto does expand, Europe won't be able to control it in any sort of a way. And then they'll see it essentially as the European citizens would prefer to use cryptocurrencies rather than a central bank governance token, for example, if they don't get a handle on it right now. So Europe's monetary sovereignty threatened by crypto. The European Central Bank no longer harbors illusions. The digital euro alone will not be enough to preserve the union's monetary sovereignty in the face of the rise of the dollar stablecoins. In a statement both clear-sighted and concerning, essentially, advisor Jürgen suggested a strict shift. The solution may not come from the European Central Bank itself, but rather from the private crypto ecosystems, which is much more responsive. The numbers essentially speak for themselves. The majority of global crypto transactions rely on dollar-backed stablecoins, such as USDT, which has just hit a new record high, or USDC, or even RLUSD. This phenomenon grants essentially monetary influence to the United States, while beyond essentially its borders. Europe, on its side, is slow to impose credible alternatives, denominated in the euros. So Europe has realized, going into a digital world, the US dollars is still number one. I could have told that to Europe about 3 years ago, that essentially the dollar is going to be still number one. Look, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, I came out on live and I said essentially that, people are saying the dollar is going to go to zero and the world is going to go digital and so on. And I said, you're not realizing the bigger picture, which is even in the digital world, the dollar is still going to be number one. I said, what is the number one stablecoin currency in the world? I said, what's the number one fiat currency in the world, mostly used? US dollars is fiat number one. And then I said, what's the number one stablecoin used in a digital world? US dollars. So at what point did people thought, yeah, the dollars is going to go to zero and disappear? Also, what's backing stablecoins like USDT, USDC, RRUSD, PYUSD? What's backing these stablecoins? US debt, US yields, US fiat dollars. So the more these stablecoins grow, the more fiat they're buying, the more yield they're buying, the more debt they're buying, and so on and so on, which also strengthens the US dollar as time goes by. The chance of the US dollar is going to zero, it's never going to happen. Because if stablecoins grow, then the fiat gets strong also. Going into a digital world, the number one is still the US dollars. Because it's not, the number one stablecoin in the world isn't the euros or the British pounds or the yen or the ruble. It's the US dollars, USDT, USDC, RLUSD, PUSD, and so on. So I could have personally told this essentially to the EU about 3 years ago. It's funny how the EU has come to the conclusion now, which is the interesting part. So Jürgen does not mince his words. Despite the existence of the framework like MICA, markets in crypto, essentially assets, Europe's stablecoins are struggling to take off. Their adoption remains marginal, hindered by essentially a lack of technological attractiveness and the absence of a truly structured ecosystem. European, essentially cryptos, too cautious, too slow, too institutional, struggles to establish itself. Europe is essentially Europe's stablecoin, the euro stablecoins are not doing too great in any sort of a way. And Europe is not happy because they thought this is their chance in a digital world to be able to compete with the US dollars, realizing now that they can't compete with the US dollars even in a digital world. Even worse, American regulations embodied by the Genius Act seems to have taken a clearer lead. While Europe is still adjusting its tax, the United States is exporting its currency on a large scale, thanks to the blockchain. The result is essentially a real loss of monetary influence for European Union. So with the United States passing a Genius Act, it pretty much opened the floodgates of US dollar stablecoins to take over the world, not just inside the United States. Again, this is just going to make Europe move faster on regulations. It's going to make a lot of other countries move faster on regulations when it comes to crypto space, which again adds to more liquidity, adds to more utility, and so on. That's a positive note that Europe is feeling left behind right now from the United States. It just means Europe is going to move faster now because they're feeling left behind. The faster they move into regulations, the better it is for us, because more liquidity enters the market space from Europe, for example, which equals slowly to utility. Faced with this observation, Jürgen does not advocate essentially or retreat. He rather calls for profound rethinking of European strategy. Crypto can no longer rely solely on central bank digital currencies. A more open, more flexible, more collaborative vision must be adopted. In an article published on the European Central Bank's website and taken up by Cointelegraph, the advisor emphasizes that the digital euros alone will not be enough to contain the rise of the stablecoins backed by the United States. In this broader approach, Europe's stablecoins, provided they are well regulated, become a primary street lever driven by private initiatives, but subjected to strict regulations. These assets could meet market needs while restoring weight to euros in the crypto universe. The second pillar of the strategy rests on leveraging distributed ledger technology, DLT, capable of modernizing large value payments and optimizing cross-border transfers. At this stage, innovation at the infrastructure level becomes crucial as monetary issuance itself, but this strategy will only work if essentially it moves beyond a fragmented approach. Jürgen essentially stresses that the necessities of international coordination to avoid disparities in rules and practices. Europe must speak with one voice, not only towards the United States, which has just adopted 3 major laws likely to reshuffle the deck, but also towards the private giants of Web3. Monetary sovereignty, long considered strictly a state issue, is now closely linked to the evolution of the crypto sector. Ignoring this would mean eventually accepting gradual disappearance of the euros in digital use. If Europe doesn't move fast enough for crypto regulations, then goodbye euros is what they're trying to say in terms of a stablecoin. A euro CBDC will obviously exist, but a Europe stablecoin, nobody's going to be using it if Europe doesn't move faster on regulations. In this perspective, the European Central Bank finally seems to willing to consider what many actors inside the crypto ecosystem have been calling for years: cooperation between the public sector and the private innovation within a framework that is both strict and open. Because in an era of decentralized currency, sovereignty is no longer written only in treaties, it is also inscribed in code. In the most simplest way, what they mean by that last essentially paragraph, or that one sentence, which is public sector and private innovation within a framework that is both strict and open. The idea of living in a world where it's fully decentralized, never going to happen. We're going into a much more centralized world, believe it or not. A lot of people inside the crypto space might be thinking to themselves, no, we're moving to a decentralized world, and so on. That's la la land. The reality of it is we're moving into a much more surveillance essentially type of world is what's actually happening. And when Europe essentially mentions, the public sector and the private innovation sector working within a framework that is both strict and open, they mean that, sure, we're going to live in a decentralized world, but with aspects of centralization within. Now, so you'll get the illusion of decentralization, but it's actually centralization as we move along. And before anybody realizes what happened, it's too late. Now, BlackRock is what we talk about next. BlackRock's Ethereum ETF could soon be offering staking services by the looks of it. SEC filing moves forward. The US SEC has acknowledged BlackRock's filing about allowing investors into its flagship Ethereum ETF to stake their assets. Although this development doesn't guarantee an official approval of the filing, it's still a big step in that right direction. Apparently, the SEC has finally decided to open up one of those essentially filings that's piling on their desk right now. I'm guessing it's up to this much of filings on their desk right now that the SEC is not looking into, because there's so many ETF applicants on that desk. But for some reason, the SEC is just reluctant. They don't care. One of them, they decided to pick it up and look, and no surprise there, it's BlackRock's essentially refiling of adding staking capabilities to Ethereum. The acknowledged part means that essentially Securities Watchdog has confirmed that it has received certain amendments made by ETF issuer. Typically, the SEC also opens a public comment period, allowing stakeholders to weigh in on the matters. BlackRock and the Nasdaq submitted a 19B4 rule change proposal that aims to allow investors using iShares Ethereum Trust to stake Ethereum with staking rewards, treated as an income to the fund. ETH is by far the largest Ethereum ETF, and it became the third fastest to reach $10 billion in assets under management milestone within less than a year after its launch. It continues to attract substantial net inflows. The last day in the red was essentially on July 2nd, with $46.9 million leaving the fund. Since then, it has essentially been on a massive roll, with essentially $4 billion in net inflows in less than a month, which is very odd. The underlying asset price essentially has benefited substantially from these enormous essentially inflows, having surged essentially by over 50% in the past month alone. Moreover, essentially ETH is up by more than essentially 150% since its essentially bottom in early April, and is close to knocking on $4,000 essentially door now. So BlackRock's Ethereum ETF application has just been looked into. It's been acknowledged by the SEC. I wish the SEC would acknowledge the other 25 essentially ETF applicants on their desk also. Now, JP Morgan is moving bitter. Simplest way to put it. JP Morgan knows that with companies like Ripple in existing, they're going to push out banks like JP Morgan. And a lot of people would say that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy to even think for a second that a company like Ripple can compete with JP Morgan. But there are signs that show that JP Morgan is threatened by Ripple's movement. By every move Ripple takes, JP Morgan is threatened. And I've explained some of those movements as well. And the recent one that essentially JP Morgan has taken is sharing data. Now, JP Morgan talked about regarding essentially fintech, companies joining essentially the banking space. Companies like Ripple that applied for a banking charter license, companies like Circle that applied for a banking charter license, or Ripple's FedEx account, essentially XRP account, and then the five banking associations that contacted essentially the OCC to tell them to slow down the progress of essentially companies like Ripple and Circle on their licensings. And one of those banking associations is backed by JP Morgan, because they know that essentially Ripple, it's coming for their seat. And JP Morgan is moving bitter. So they talked about how, sharing data, they're going to charge fintech companies now. JP Morgan said, if we're going to work with fintech companies, Ripple, then we're going to charge them for data, is what they said. And there's a reason why people don't like banks. There's many reasons why people don't like banks, because one of them being it's your money, but the bank acts like it's their money, and they tell you what you can do and what you can't do with your money, which is just stupid to begin with. But there's many reasons why people don't like banks. And the number one reason you could pretty much say is that greed is why people don't like banks. Greed is, I would say, the number one reason why people don't like banks, and why a lot of people around the world are actually unbanked. And this is a clear example of greed and also bitterness. JP Morgan Chase will begin charging fintech intermediaries for data access as early as October, citing system strains from 1.89 billion monthly requests that primarily serve as non-customer purposes. The largest bank in the US disclosed that only 13% of data pulls from aggregators like Plaid actually stem from customer essentially initiated transactions in June. An internal JP Morgan memo reveals the scope of what executives describe as unnecessary system taxation. Aggregators are essentially assessing customer data multiple times daily, even when the customer is not actively using the app. wrote essentially a systems employee to retail payments head, Melissa, the memo categorizes these requests as massively taxing our systems. The bank's data shows API call volumes have more than doubled over 2 years. Among 13 tracked companies, a single aggregator generated 1.08 billion requests in June alone. Sources familiar with the matter identified this company as a play whose customers initiated calls represented just 6% of total activity. So JP Morgan is saying, it's putting a strain on JP Morgan, and that's for, our justification to charge these fintech companies tax for sharing data with them. But if you just go a few days back, I think JP Morgan might think to themselves, people are that forgetful. If you go a few days back, when the Genius Act passed, JP Morgan actually said that if fintech companies are going to enter the banking space, that we're going to charge them for data. And that was their reasoning then, that if fintech companies are going to enter essentially into the banking space, then we're just going to charge them data. But now they're coming out and saying it's putting a strain on us. That's why we're trying to charge them for data sharing. Because, if Ripple gets a license and Circle gets a license, these banks are supposed to share data together with these fintech companies. By law, they're supposed to be sharing those data. They're supposed to be opening their books to each other in some sort of a way. Not fully, but in some sort of way sharing data. And JP Morgan was not happy about that. With Ripple getting a license, a banking charter license, and they have to share data with Ripple or Circle or any other essentially, institution out there. But now they're coming up with the excuse of it's putting a strain on JP Morgan. And that's why we have to charge these new fintech companies tax money. Sources familiar with the matter identified this company as Plate, whose customers initially calls represented just 6% of total activities. Negotiations between JP Morgan and fintech middleman continue ahead of October's implementation. The proposed fee structure could fundamentally alter the economics of an ecosystem that has operated on free data access for years. It's been free data access for years. All of a sudden, Ripple and Circle applying for a banking license. JP Morgan's throwing a hissy fit and saying, no, we're going to charge them for data, even though it's been free since the dawn of time. JP Morgan's internal analysis links agriculture, essentially, involvements to elevate fraud risk. And then also ACH transactions processed through data middleman show 69% higher fraud claim rates compared to essentially direct banking channels. The bank also observed approximately $50 million in agriculture-related fraud claims, with projections suggesting essentially this figure could triple within 5 years. These financial losses essentially compound infrastructure costs as JP Morgan maintains systems handling billions of monthly data requests. The bank argues that current essential arrangements unfairly burden traditional institutions while agricultures monetize connectivity services. The timing coincides with legal challenges to the Biden-era open banking regulations. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's rule mandating free data access faces industry lawsuits, with the CFPB filing motions supporting banking sector challenges in May. JP Morgan and other banks around it essentially were able to get the CFPB to stand in favor of JP Morgan and say, yeah, why should we be sharing free data with these essentially fintech companies? We should be charging the fintech companies. This is why people hate banks, because they don't play a fair game. They've never played a fair game. Plate also disputes that JP Morgan's categorization of data usage patterns. The company argues that all activity originates from customer authorizations during account setups, though many users rarely examine lengthy terms of service agreements containing data sharing provisions. Calling a bank's API when a user is not present once they have authorized the connection is a standard industry essentially practice supported by all major banks, Plate stated. The company enables essentially critical services including overdrafts, alerts, and suspicious activity monitoring that require continuous data access. Venture capital investors and fintech essentially executives have criticized JP Morgan's approach as an anti-competitive rent-seeking behavior. Fintech companies are basically calling JP Morgan money hungry and a greedy bastard. They argue that the paywall restricts innovation and consumer access to financial services that emerged from open data sharing. The fee implementation could reshape fintech industry dynamics that flourished under essentially free data access models. build profitable essentially businesses, connecting traditional banks with newer financial applications, offering a no-fee essentially checking and trading services. Many of these essentially agreements may become economically unviable under paid access essentially structures. JP Morgan's executives indicate proactive essentially discussions with several aggregators willing to modify their data collection practices. Both sides fully acknowledge essentially there are things they could do right size, called essentially volume. Said one person familiar with negotiations, the bank's position reflects broader industry tensions as traditional institutions adapt to digital infrastructure and transformation demands. CEO Jamie Dimon previously urged banks to fight back against regulations he categorized as unfair to established players. What JP Morgan's CEO is referring to, Jamie Dimon, is the Genius Act. Jamie Dimon does not like the Genius Act whatsoever because it gives companies like Ripple an advantage, and Circle and Tether. The remaining companies in JP Morgan's tracking data represent significantly smaller operations. Only 4 other middlemen registered more than $100 million monthly API calls, suggesting Plaid's dominant market position essentially makes it practically vulnerable to fee implementation. Forbes, for now, until the rest pass, Forbes reported that proposed fee schedules could result in $300 million annual costs for Plaid's. Such expenses essentially would likely force business model adjustments throughout the algorithm essentially ecosystems. Legal essentially resolutions of open banking regulations will determine whether data access fees become industry standards. Courts may ultimately decide the balance between innovation, promotion, and infrastructure costs distributions in modern banking. JP Morgan's fee implementation represents a fundamental shift in fintech industry economics, potentially ending essentially years of free data access that enabled rapid essentially ecosystem growth. The outcome of the ongoing negotiations and legal challenges will determine whether other major banks will follow similar approaches, reshaping the competitive landscape for financial technology companies. So JP Morgan is saying that, our beef so far is just with Plaid, one company that wants access to our data, and we're going to charge them money. But what I'm actually saying is that any fintech company that wants to share data, that wants to get data essentially from JP Morgan is going to be charging them. Just fintech companies. So if another bank comes to JP Morgan, a traditional bank comes to JP Morgan to share data with them, to share data back with them, JP Morgan's fine with that. And that could be also billions of files and data and so on, and codes of line. And that's okay with JP Morgan. But if Ripple comes forward, or Circle comes forward, or Tether comes forward, or any other essentially fintech company comes forward, they're charging them money for them, simply as. This is going to put JP Morgan in back-to-back lawsuits because it's against the law in some sort of way. Unless JP Morgan has found a loophole around it, but it is still against the law because it was under Biden's era that they essentially put that law into place where essentially it's supposed to be free data, continuing free data access for all these banks to communicate with each other, or even fintech companies that want to get involved. But it just shows you that JP Morgan knows they have essentially lost the war, that blockchain is here to take over, and banks like JP Morgan will eventually be left in the past. Essentially, honestly, they'll just be left behind is what's going to happen. It just shows you that how threatened they are, because this is a pathetic attempt by JP Morgan to be slowing down again the progress of fintech companies by charging them fees to share data. And this could go up to like $300 million, $500 million, $1 billion, depending on how much data is going to be shown. So it's a very pathetic attempt from JP Morgan to slow down once again the progress of blockchain companies. It's a good thing Ripple has very deep pockets. Not sure about the rest of them. I think Circle is going to struggle a bit. Now, moving on to Ripple news on tonight's live. Before we talk about the next news on tonight's live, let's go inside the comment section first, and then we'll go straight into the next news. Let's see where we were at. We were at here. You always said the US dollar is not going anywhere and BRICS will not take over. Facts. I did always say that. I said the US dollars is never going away. If it's either going to stay where it is in fiat and slowly go into essentially the dollar form of digital dollars. Dollars is never going away. And I also said 2-3 years ago that BRICS coin, BRICS token, or BRICS currency, never going to happen. And you fast forward to today in 2025 on the 29th, and BRICS currency, never going to happen. Digital dollars is still number one. Miles, we all thought that essentially Paul Atkins was pro-crypto, so why is he delaying all the ETFs? Is Paul becoming more like Gary Gensler? I'm starting to get a hint that Paul, no, here's the thing with essentially Paul from the SEC. Preferably, I like Mark, the acting chairman of the SEC. He was a lot more better, a lot more faster than Paul has ever been so far. But according to the SEC, they're trying to create a framework to pass essentially ETFs at a much more faster rate. That's according to the SEC themselves. They're creating some sort of an ETF framework to pass applicants much more faster through it. But the logical thing would just be to pass the applicants on your desk instead of trying to create this framework for the ETF applicants to refile under your new framework to pass their ETF applications. Why spend so much time, money, and resources on creating something that isn't needed? Just pass the applicants already on your desk is what I would do if I worked in the SEC. Why would I spend time, money, and resources creating something to make everybody refile so I can pass their applications when I could just pass their applications and save time, money, and resources? So it's a stupid idea that the SEC has right now going on. My guess would be, honestly, the Trump administration and Trump needs to look into the SEC once again, because what's going on there isn't right. If genuinely they're trying to create a process to make things move faster, good on them, trying to create a process to make ETF applications move faster. But either way, it's a stupid idea. Good on them trying to make it work, but it's a stupid idea. Just pass the applications. Because the longer they take, the more advantage they're giving to Bitcoin and Ethereum ETFs, to be fairly honest, which isn't right in any sort of a way. And on the topic of the SEC, actually, perfect timing, Funky Brother. On the topic of the SEC, Ripple's essentially XRP versus SEC case update as of July 29th, 2025. So, the long-running legal battle between Ripple Labs and the US Securities Exchange Commission, SEC, is entering essentially a stage with a critical court deadline fast approaching. The outcome could influence not just XRP's future, but also shape the broader regulatory landscape for digital assets worldwide. By August 15th, the SEC must submit a formal update on essentially to the appealing courts outlining the current status of its appealing against Ripple. By August 15th, not exactly on August 15th, but by the time we get to August 15th, the SEC should be sending in some sort of update on why they're still continuing their appeal on Ripple. The appeal process had been paused to allow both parties. It has been paused to allow both parties to explore the possibility of a private resolution. While this upcoming deadline essentially is coming up, it has the potential to mark a major turning point inside the case. Former SEC attorney Mark commented on the matter. He said, clarifying that essentially, although the August update isn't a ruling or a dismissal, he believes there's a strong chance the SEC could choose to drop the appeal altogether, either on August 15th or before August 15th, essentially completely dropping the SEC case. And essentially with Ripple, this is coming from essentially a former SEC attorney. So far, the legal proceedings have produced one significant outcome. A court ruling confirmed that the XRP is not considered security when sold on retail investors. However, XRP classification in institutional transactions remains unresolved. This regulatory gray area continues to generate uncertainty, leaving both crypto firms and insider investors looking to Ripple's case for further clarity. Market participants are hopeful that the final resolution of the case will offer a clearer roadmap for compliance, especially essentially regarding token offerings and sale structures and the distinction between retail and institutional markets. And let's not forget, we also have the Clarity Act coming up as well. The Clarity Act has had its first round of votings. If the Clarity Act gets its second round of votings and it's approved, which it will do, then it's going to put the SEC in a very difficult position, because the Clarity Act will state what is a security and what is a commodity, and what should be under the SEC and what should be under the CFTC's authority, is what the Clarity Act is going to do, and a lot of other things, but that's the main point that we care about. Once that passes through completely as well and is signed by Trump, that's going to put more pressure on the SEC on this confusing situation they just won't let go of. Conceding essentially also with the court deadlines, interesting enough, the SEC case deadline pretty much is August 15th. And by that time, we should get a response by the SEC, and they have to appeal. Essentially, they have to drop the appeal. There's nothing for them to move on forward to whatsoever, especially now going to regulations. None whatsoever. So as much as JP Morgan might have still some sort of a grip on the SEC's movements and footpath, that grip should get loose pretty damn soon, especially if we get to a Clarity Act, or essentially if we get to the deadline of August 15th, because what the hell is the SEC going to say? Because Gary Gensler is not there anymore to give stupid answers. This is essentially Atkins, and Atkins has to give, well, straightforward answers. And what's he going to say? We're still going to act like Gary Gensler? He can't say that. He was chosen by Trump to be pro-crypto. He was chosen by his administration to be pro-crypto. So he has no choice but to be pro-crypto. So he can waste time up to a certain limit, but after that time runs out, Paul has to let go of the case, and JP Morgan's essentially grip on the SEC has to get loose. Also, the interesting factor is August 15th, conceding with the court, the court deadline is conceding with the BRICS 2025 summit. So as essentially Ripple's deadline is coming on August 15th, it's also the same timing that essentially the BRICS summit is going on, scheduled essentially for August 9th to August 15th in Russia. The summit's agenda includes key discussions on developing essentially some sort of data sharing and their de-dollarization strategies that's been going on for the longest time, and the integration of blockchain technologies and digital assets into international finance. This overlap in timing has sparked interest among crypto analysts and investors. Ripple's blockchain-based payment solutions, particularly essentially to its use of XRP for cross-border settlements, could play a vital role in shaping or supporting such global initiatives, especially if legal uncertainty surrounding the company is resolved by then. As August 15th deadline nears, anticipation is building essentially across the crypto space. Whether the SEC decides to pursue its appeal or drop entirely, it remains uncertain, but the implications are significant. This legal showdown essentially is no longer just about Ripple and the SEC. It essentially has become a defining moment for the future of cryptocurrency regulations inside the United States. At the same time, developments on the international stage could open new doors for XRP. If regulatory clarity emerges just as global financial leaders are exploring digital asset integrations, Ripple and XRP could find themselves at the center of a major financial transformation. Also, to add on top of that, can XRP become the glue of a fragmented financial system? Among them, essentially, what we're going to talk about now, essentially, is Michael. Michael, essentially, the CEO, and also the CEO of AG, Oliver, who sees essentially Ripple's token as a potential link between the fragmented worlds of traditional and digital finance. So Oliver essentially has come forward as essentially AG's CEO and said that, in the world that we're in right now, going towards this digital sector, he sees XRP as essentially the backbone of fixing this fragmented financial sector. So here it is. Michael suggests that as the central banks race towards digital currencies, few are building the infrastructure needed to support them. That's where he believes Ripple comes in. Instead of creating complex new systems from scratch, institutions could tap into Ripple's existing blockchain rails, ones already designed to connect banks, businesses, and currencies across borders. XRP's design as a neutral bridge asset could make it a digital glue for more interoperable, essentially, financial systems. And Ripple's ongoing effort to work alongside networks like SWIFT, positioning essentially for mainstream adoption, that vision is already seeing traction. A NASDAQ-listed pharma company, Wellgistics Health, recently adopted XRP Ledger to streamline its operations, signaling real-world use beyond theory. Whether XRP will ever serve as a global reserve asset, but its trajectory suggests it's aiming far beyond just crypto. It definitely is. I've said this, many times, and I'll say it again. XRP is in a different league compared to any other cryptocurrency out there. When it comes to finance, XRP is just in a different league by miles ahead of any other crypto project out there when it comes to finance. If it comes to AI, XRP is pretty much last because it doesn't rank in AI whatsoever. If it comes to gaming, it's last. But if we're talking about essentially finance, Ripple XRP is just in a whole other league when it comes to finance by a mile. And this CEO, essentially, AG is essentially Tokenist Investments AG CEO coming out saying XRP essentially is going to be the glue of the financial sector, and giving an example of a pharmaceutical company that's actually using XRP in terms of usage, and showing that it's gone beyond just a theory and now it's real world use cases that's happening from this pharmaceutical company. Also adds just more credibility, to essentially XRP's main infrastructure, you could pretty much say. And also regarding what Funky Brother has said, is Paul Atkins becoming more like Gary Gensler? No. Paul Atkins is far from becoming like Gary Gensler. Paul Atkins just has a very unusual method of him wanting to create a framework to pass applications rather than just passing applications. It's not that he's saying, I won't pass applications in any sort of way. He hasn't said that. The SEC is still, showing signs of being pro-crypto. They haven't shown any negativity towards the crypto space, except essentially extending some deadlines here and there. But they haven't shown any sort of negativity or doubling down on their lawsuits, because if Paul Atkins was becoming like Gary Gensler, then he would have continued this lawsuit by essentially appealing more filings against Ripple and so on, which they haven't done. They haven't continued this lawsuit, they just haven't dropped it. There's a big difference between continuing and dropping it. If they continue this lawsuit by filing for something else against Ripple, then he's became Gary Gensler 2.0. But since essentially Paul Atkins hasn't filed anything extra against Ripple since the day Gary Gensler has left, then he hasn't become Gary Gensler at all. He's far from it, actually. It's just he has an unusual method of first creating a framework, then to pass ETF applications. It's a very weird method he has going on. But anyways, putting that to one side, even essentially this CEO coming out regarding XRP, showing it once again has credibility towards XRP's title. And also XRP, Ripple, as I shared yesterday, signed a new patent for a new payment system to be used, which is brilliant. And also essentially adding to the factor that if you wanted to know some sort of deadline regarding XRP, well, August 15th, essentially by August 15th, this case should go away 100%. On that note, we have also reached the endings of tonight's live. If you're watching this for the first time ever, this was called the CMF Live. It stands for Crypto Mouse Family. My name is Miles. You can tune to this live Monday to Friday, 10 p.m. London time onwards, where I share the most recent news regarding cryptocurrency, CBDCs, AI, politics, and regulations, and I share you my perspective on them. And we also do Q&As on this live as well, which means if you do ever have any questions, always put it down in the comment section. More than happy to help you out. And the disclaimer of this live has always been not financial advice, no political advice, and whatever I say is only for entertainment purposes. So we have reached the endings of tonight's live. On tonight's live, we talked about XRP, a perspective that came out from a CEO. We also talked about on tonight's live regarding Ripple's essentially timeline on their case. We went through news on regarding essentially JP Morgan's bitterness towards fintech companies. We talked about BlackRock's Ethereum ETF, essentially staking rewards, may be coming soon. We also went through news on tonight's live regarding European Central Bank and stablecoin regulations. We also went through news on tonight's live regarding the White House taking steps to maybe sidestep, essentially, Brian, from CFTC. We talked about Investigo Galaxy essentially proposing a Solana ETF staking services. We went through news regarding the US actually introducing a bill for mortgages when it comes to cryptocurrencies. And we talked about on tonight's live regarding essentially the digital Rube. There's a A7, A5 stablecoin that's came out of Russia. Massive usage going on right there. And we also went through news regarding 21 Capital, another company that's added a Bitcoin, substantial amount of Bitcoin to their portfolios. We went through Hong Kong news on tonight's live regarding regulations, which adds quite a lot of essentially liquidity towards the table. And we also went through US Treasury essentially Secretary news regarding hints of Europe might be next in essentially putting tariffs on China, which is, as I said, an interesting plot twist on that matter. So we have reached the endings of tonight's live, and those are the news topics we discussed on tonight's live. This was episode 344 of the CMF Live. Tune in for episode 335 tomorrow. Before we do go, obviously, let's go inside the comment section first, and then we'll call it a night. And I'll see everybody tomorrow. Good night, Miles. CMF, it's getting exciting. The SEC will let go XRP. Thanks, Miles, for the great live. See you tomorrow. Free forever. See you tomorrow. Same time as usual. Good night, Miles, and all CMF. Thank you for a great live and news. Let's go, JP. See you tomorrow, brother. Same time as usual. Good night, Miles and CMF family. See you tomorrow, Frankie, brother. Same timing as usual. Good night, brother. Thanks for another great show. Let's go. Comatose. See you tomorrow. Same time as usual. Hi, Miles. Late, but we'll review. Let's go, Mav. See you tomorrow, brother. Same time as usual. Good night, Miles and CMF. Great live. See you tomorrow. Same time as usual. Carol. Good night, Miles and CMF. Take care and see you tomorrow. Mike. See you tomorrow, brother. Same time as usual. Just once again, CMF members, if you have already liked and retweeted this live on X and you're watching this on X right now, thank you so much to everybody who liked and retweeted this live on X. If you haven't, CMF members, liked and retweeted this live, please like and please retweet this live and put a comment outside live. Also, if you followed me during this live on X or on YouTube, thank you so much for following me and subscribing to me. Welcome to the CMF. Also, eventually, if you're watching us on YouTube and you've liked the live, thank you so much as well. If you haven't liked the live on YouTube, please like the live and leave a comment outside live also. And I will see everybody tomorrow, same timing as usual, for episode 345 of the CMF Live. Tomorrow, just like usual, Monday to Friday, 10 p.m. London time. Thanks, Miles, and good night, Stormy. See you tomorrow, same time as usual as well. I made it just in time to say bye. Let's go, Susie. Susie, see you tomorrow, same time as usual, a bit earlier this time. I'll see you tomorrow, same time as usual. I will see everybody tomorrow, same timing as usual. Everybody have a great day or a good night, depending on where you're around the world. And the disclaimer of this live, as always, is not financial advice, not political advice, and whatever I say, only for entertainment purposes. See everybody tomorrow, same time as usual. Everybody have a great day or a good night, depending on where you're around the world. Love you all, CMF.